in your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as the anointed Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. He made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant. So the word is doulos, slave. He humbled himself by becoming obedient, even to the cross. So the question is, why did Jesus come in the form of a servant? Why did he take upon himself the role of a slave? And I'm sure that the answer to that is multifaceted. There are many things that are involved in that, but I came across an article discussing that this past week, and they suggested the idea that oh, good. The back screen is right. I'm assuming that the back here was the same as that, and it's not. So you're seeing what you should be seeing. I'm not. So the suggestion was that if we wanted to qualify sin, at the very top of the list would be the sin of pride. And that conclusion is based on the fact that as we understand what we think we know about Lucifer, Satan, the devil, he was cast out of heaven for what reason? Because of pride, right? And that's what's described in the Hebrew Scripture, that he had decided he wanted to be equal to or greater than God, and that resulted in him being cast out of heaven. And then in the Garden of Eden, the sin that beset Adam and Eve was that this same Lucifer convinced them that it wasn't enough to be the children of God. They needed to be equal to God. They needed to know good from evil. They needed to know the things that would make them more godlike, which was an appeal to their pride. And so the antithesis of that, the anecdote for that, as Jesus came and modeled the heart of the Father, was that he took upon himself the form of a servant, a slave. And he models that for us. And so we read in Galatians 6:2-3, share each other's burden, and in this way obey the law of Christ. And then Paul gets a little bit snippy about it. If you think you're too important to help someone, you're only fooling yourself. And then he adds, you're not that important. So how do we avoid pride? How do we take on the form of a servant, the role of a slave? It's by the way we humble ourselves in helping others in their time of need. Make sense? I had another slide up there that somehow didn't show up, or else I missed it. Maybe it was up there and I clicked through it because I'm not seeing what you see. Could you go back to the beginning slide and let me go through this again, please? Can you do that for me? Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is one that I wanted to, this is one it doesn't show up back here. What do you see?
A bunch of people scribbling and somebody erasing.
What are they scribbling? Like Mike said, a lot of people scribbling and somebody erasing it. What are they scribbling?
Lines.
What kind of lines?
They're making their mark on the earth.
They're making their mark on the earth, but what does that mark look like? What are they drawing? Dividing lines, but what else? Drawing boxes, right? And then that guy that's got his pencil turned upside down, who's that? That's Jesus. And what's Jesus doing? Erasing those boxes. So how many times have you and I been guilty of trying to put God in a box? And Jesus came in his countercultural manner, erasing those boxes. And that's what finally got him killed, isn't it? Because the Jewish people had built these boxes, and the boxes kept getting smaller and smaller and tighter. And Jesus took his pencil and proceeded to erase those boxes. Whether it was the Sabbath law or anything that put law over people. And I think that, there's a lesson here for us that it's so easy for us. And I think that we, in most of our religious organizations, but maybe more especially in churches of Christ, have really been intent upon drawing boxes for God and putting God into sometimes ever smaller boxes. And yet if we put on the mind of Christ, seek the heart of Christ, then we'll see him as he goes about erasing those boxes. All right? Okay, so we were talking at the end of the class last week about the wedding at Cana, and what that reveals to us about the heart of Christ. And we had a couple of comments from David and from Mike and from one or two others of you, but as you think about that wedding at Cana, it was an occasion that Jesus was not yet prepared to reveal himself, but he changed his mind because his mother asked him. He participated in a very festive occasion, and something that you and I probably would never have imagined that he would do. His first revealed sign of his power to John, as John records it, was to turn the water in the ceremonial jars into the very best wine, and an abundance of that wine. So some of the things that we talked about last week were I'll get to it in a second. Well, where did it go? Anyway, you know the story. So are there any other thoughts about that anybody has thought of this week that you would care to share as to why, or as to what is revealed about the heart of Jesus by the events that took place there in Cana of Galilee?
Well, as I was thinking about it a little more, I'm not sure that there wasn't, and I don't say this in a bad way, a little procrastination. Like we always assume, like, or I have, that like on day 3, this is what I'm going to do. It's all laid out for me, the choice. And that was a hard choice to make, to get in, because he knew the end result and everything. And it's not my time yet. Well, when is your time going to come? But I began, and maybe this is just because of the movie that was put forth, began to think that God put it in front of him, and he recognized when he dipped his hand in the water that turned to wine, realizing the blood that he was going to shed, the emblem that he would later lift up and say, "This is my blood given for you," that this was the opportunity that he recognized. Okay, it is time. My Father says it's time. I'm going forth.
Yeah, he wasn't ready, but he accepted the fact that God had laid this in front of him through his mother, that it's time. Now's the time. And it was hard for him because he knew the path that was coming, and he was ready to postpone it as long as he could, rightfully so. Anybody else? Okay. Maybe I do have it up here. And I'm sorry I'm confused, but what's on my screen is different from yours. So if I turn my back on you, would that work better? So here are the things that we talked about last week a little bit, and we'll wrap it up with this. He cares for our hurts, our fears, and our embarrassments. He can be persuaded by his mother. He knows how and is willing to laugh, celebrate, and enjoy a good party. I don't think that we've always grown up with that image of Jesus in our mind. I'm only speaking for myself. I've always kind of grown up with the idea of a much more serious, somber, almost fatalistic image of Jesus. And yet, if you really read the scriptures without that preconception, you see somebody that, he loves kids. He loves a good party. He turns water to wine, for goodness sake. And it's really not the image that I always grew up with. And he certainly gave his stamp of approval on the institution of marriage by being there and celebrating in that way. So, he leaves there and he goes to Capernaum. Capernaum is a little fishing village established during the Hasmonean period, beginning about 140 BC. It probably had about 1,500 inhabitants in Jesus' day. Continued to be occupied until the 10th century AD, shortly before the First Crusade. And I say it continued to be occupied, but there were periods where it went dormant and then was reestablished. In 1895, the part containing the synagogue and Peter's house was purchased by the Franciscan Order of the Catholic Church, and they have done a lot of things there that have been very interesting and revealing. And when you go to Israel, this is one of the places you go, and for me, it's probably one of two or three highlights in Israel, and I'll explain that. The eastern half of the site, maybe at least a third or more of the area that's been excavated, and very little of it has been excavated, of course. There's a lot more to be found. But the eastern half of the site is owned by the Greek Orthodox Church, and they really have shut down excavation there for whatever reason. But there's a picture of the not so little church that the Greek Orthodox have built there on that site. And then there was a time when it came under Palestinian oversight, and the Palestinian population was removed during the 1947 Civil War following Israeli statehood. Now, I don't have any of this on my back screen at all, so I'm going to have to turn around a little bit. I like Capernaum And I'm calling it Capernaum. Some people call it Capernaum. I think I have the Hebrew pronunciation up here somewhere maybe. But I like it because so many of the places that we go in Israel are tourist locations where we remember an event. For example, we go to the site of the memorial tourist shop, actually, if you want to know the truth, tourist shop of the Good Samaritan event. Well, the Good Samaritan was not an event, it was a parable. But never pass up a good opportunity to make a buck, right? So you put a tourist center somewhere on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho so that you can sell artifacts. So, that's all right. But some places, and Capernaum is one of them, where this is the exact site, the synagogue where Jesus taught, where Jesus walked. It's right on the Sea of Galilee. This is a picture of that I took with some of my friends from California, the black gentleman and his wife. The black gentleman was a co-elder of mine at Fairfield. He still is there, and a real good friend. And the other couple in the middle, the Bezaritas family, have been very dear friends of ours ever since we met them. She was the principal for our private school that I administered in Fairfield, and she was really special to me because she did all of the work and I took all of the honor and glory. But she knew that was the case and let me do it anyway. But they're very dear friends, and was happy to have them with us on that trip. I just took this because bougainvilleas are everywhere. I don't know if I've ever been anywhere in the world that there weren't bougainvilleas. And this was an especially attractive vine right there at the entrance to Capernaum. These are some of the excavated structures that are here in Capernaum. And this happens to be one of the columns, and you can see the menorah there at the top. It's a Corinthian column if you're into Greek architecture. And this is a close-up of that menorah, the seven-stemmed candelabra that is so typical of Greek, of Hebrew history, and was, of course, in the holy place of the temple. This is a statue of Peter that was right there in the courtyard, and he has the keys of the kingdom in his right hand. He has a shepherd's nook in his left hand, and he has the fish at his foot, and that's the fish that bears his name over there. It's called the St. Peter fish. You and I call it tilapia. Here's an overview of the area there in Capernaum that they've excavated. You can see the houses. And this particular edifice that you see there in the background is built over what is traditionally believed to be the house of Peter, where Peter and his wife and mother lived, and where Jesus also, we believe, stayed. This is a picture in the synagogue, and this is exactly where Jesus walked and talked. Some of our people up there, you may recognize some of those people from here who were with us. Another shot of the synagogue, and here the black layer there that you see is the actual floor of the synagogue where Jesus walked. They have built on top of it over the years, but they've bored down to to the actual original floor of that synagogue. And this is a sign there at that location, the late 4th century AD white synagogue built upon the remains of the synagogue of Jesus. I've got a little.
Can I tell a story?
Yes.
We went to Israel some years ago, and we went into Capernaum. And walking in that synagogue during that day, it was kind of a misty rain, you know. And so as I was exiting this, I slipped on the steps, and I fell right straight down and plopped down on that step. And I'm just sitting there kind of stunned, and it just hit me. Jesus probably sat there. He probably talked to people. And it was just an overwhelming experience that's where he was, you know. And I got to share a little bit of space of where he was at.
Yeah. Any of the rest of you who have been to Capernaum, Al, do you want to talk about your visit there?
I mentioned to Lanny this morning, was he in Israel? And he commented, yes. My wife and I were also there, and a very enjoyable trip.
You were with us, yep. Davenports, you have anything you want to add? You were with us. No? Were you impressed with Capernaum like I am? Yeah, okay. She's not gonna narrow it down for me. Anybody else? I'm not sure if it's next or not, but I've got a little travelogue too for you that I came across on YouTube, and I've shortened it a little bit for time's sake, but it'll give you a broad overview of Capernaum. I'm not sure if it's next or not. Yeah, it is.
The one building that stands out is the synagogue built out of white limestone. Let's go into the ancient synagogue. So this is the late 4th century white synagogue built upon the remains of the synagogue of Jesus. You can see the older synagogue was made out of basalt rock. And then in the 5th century, a renovation was made, and the white synagogue was built on top. The white synagogue was built in the basilica design with 2 rows of columns dividing the space into 2 naves. The entrance is decorated with carved stone friezes with typical Jewish symbols such as flower wreaths, palm trees, and geometric designs. Here's an amphora with grapes growing out of it. Here, Hebrew inscription. And a menorah. Another Star of David, grapes, pomegranates, another Star of David. There's a pit here where you can look down and see possibly the ruins of an earlier synagogue, maybe even back to the 1st century, to the time of Jesus, because they walked over to the house. Look how close the synagogue is to the house. We're in the synagogue, and there's the house right underneath the church that's on the stilts. Very close to the synagogue, the excavations revealed a house that looks very different than all the other homes of the town. The house was enlarged and expanded 3 times, and the final phase was a 5th century octagonal church with a mosaic floor. The explanation is that this must have been the house owned by St. Peter and his family, and one room was Jesus' room. The early Christians living in the town venerated this room, then later turned it into a house church, the Domus Ecclesia, And finally, during the Byzantine period, a church was built on the exact location of Jesus' room in St. Peter's house. And of course, the modern church was built on top about 20 years ago. It was built on stilts. So the ancient ruins of Peter's house could remain visible, and there's a glass floor inside the church where you can look down and see the ruins. Before we walk down to the beach, let's take a closer look at the statue of Simon, son of Jonah, the Galilean fisherman from Capernaum. In his hands, he is holding the keys to the kingdom of heaven and the shepherd's staff, and at his feet is the fish named after him, St. Peter's fish. And the new name, Peter, the rock, given to him by Jesus. It's a copy of the mosaic floor of the 5th century church built above St. Peter's house. And in the center of the mosaic is a depiction of a peacock. The peacock was used in the ancient Christian art as a symbol of the resurrection and the afterlife. We see the peacock symbol in many churches in the Holy Land. Walking here on the shores of the Sea of Galilee is where I would like to remind us all that one could argue over the location of a building or a house, but the Lake Kinneret, hasn't changed. The scenery, the smell, the sound of the water, they are all exactly the same as they were back in the 1st century. Next time you visit, make time to sit here for a few minutes and just let the lake guide you.
Had you ever heard the peacock being used in Christian artistry as a symbol of the resurrection and afterlife? Had you heard that, David? I hadn't either, and I missed that when I was over there, but I don't question it. It was just something new to me. Mm-hmm. Any other questions or thoughts on Capernaum? I spent a little bit more time on it than I probably should have, but it's just one of my more favorite areas. Of course, it's right there on the northern side of what we call the Sea of Galilee, very close to Bethsaida and the other areas there where several of the apostles grew up. So, and also a place that Jesus was very involved in the ministry that he had in the northern part of Israel. All right. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. When we look at a map, we talk about up north, down south. But in Hebrew terminology, Jerusalem is always up. It doesn't matter where you are geographically. And that has a little bit to do with the elevation of Jerusalem, but a whole lot to do with the importance that the Jewish people placed upon the city. So wherever you were in Israel, you always went up to Jerusalem. In the temple court, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at the tables exchanging money. I found this little picture I thought was kind of telling. If anyone asks you, what would Jesus do? Remind them that he flipped over tables and chased people with a whip among the realm of possibilities. We don't usually dwell on that aspect of Jesus, but it's true. And he not only did it once, most authorities agree he did it twice. We're going to see him here as he first on this trip to Jerusalem on the Passover. He's going to turn over the money changers' tables and drive the merchants out of the temple area. And then when's he going to do it again? Passion Week, right? When he comes into Jerusalem the last time before his death. So it's kind of a bookend thing. Here we have him right at the beginning of his ministry, and we're going to see it again at the very conclusion of his earthly ministry. He's going to do the same thing. This is a picture of the Temple Mount, and you've seen this several times, but I kind of wanted to orient you to where this event is taking place, where he's going to be turning over the table of the money changers. We're looking here at the eastern wall of the Temple Mount. To our right, and on the northeast corner, is the Roman garrison. And to the left, the southern side, are the steps, the southern steps on which Pentecost, the Holy Spirit descending on Pentecost occurred. And on the opposite side, the western side, is the western wall we sometimes call the Wailing Wall. And then that southwest corner is where we see all of the shops, the merchants' shops, where the buying and the selling were going on. And I don't know if you can pick it out in the midst of all of that busyness, but there's a stairway leading straight up and then turning hard to the right and going into the Temple Mount. That is Robinson's Arch. There's a little bit better artist concept of it. And it's a pier of large stones which originally supported the western springer of Robinson Arch. The pier enclosed 4 cubicles that serve as shops opening onto the paved street. So there were shops under it, and then there were shops all around it, and there was an entranceway into the temple there. This is a picture I took when we were there. This is what's left of Robinson's Arch. Of course, the gateway has been closed up, but you can see just the point there at which the arch attached itself to the western wall of the temple. And then this is some of the shop area where the money changers and the people who were dealing with the sacrificial offerings, buying and selling sacrificial offerings, would have had their shops. This is just a picture of the southern wall. There's the steps that led up to a couple of the gates in the southern wall, and this is where Peter and the apostles were preaching when the Holy Spirit descended with tongues of fire and sat upon them on the day of Pentecost. In the background, you can see the Mount of Olives, and on the side of the Mount of Olives, all of those structures you see there are crypts or above ground graves. People who have a lot of money like to buy grave sites there on the side of the Mount of Olives. You can imagine why, right? Jesus is going to come back to the Mount of Olives, and they want to be first in line. So if you want to be at the head of the line when Jesus comes back, see if you can buy one of these crypts over there. This is a little bit closer up view of those, and you see the rocks on there. That's a custom they have of putting rocks on, like you and I would maybe put flowers on a gravesite here. It's a way that they show their respect for family members or friends or whoever that happens to be there. All of the graves seem to have these rocks that have been placed on them. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Can anybody tell me what's wrong with that picture on the right? What do you think's wrong with it, Jeff? You got it figured out yet?
The other one was happy. That one was happy, and the white one wasn't happy.
Okay, I'll buy that.
Am I correct?
Yeah, thank you. What else? That's a good start. What else?
It's not empty.
It's not empty.
They just tipped it up and it hadn't all fallen off.
Yeah, it hadn't fallen off. What's wrong with it is it's wooden. They didn't have wood to use for tables. If you've been over there, you've seen them. Those money changer tables are a solid slab of concrete, rock. What does that tell you about Jesus? He's a manly man. This idea we have about this little wimpy guy is just not right. He worked in stone his whole life. And when it came time to turn over the money changers' tables, he was hefting some weight. When he pulled out a whip and started swinging it around, it was time to move out of the way.
Do you not think that the whip was more for the cattle and sheep and stuff, and the tables was enough to get the people?
Was the whipping mostly for the cattle and sheep, and the table more to just to make an impression on them? I'm not sure. Maybe. I'm not sure. I wouldn't have wanted to get in front of him if I were one of the people who were taking advantage and defrauding the people at that time. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" And as we mentioned, he's going to do the same thing again when he comes to the end of his ministry. It says a couple of things. He was certainly consistent, but also they didn't learn very much from the first time. It didn't make a big enough impression on him that he had to come back and do it again by about 3 years later. So what made Jesus so angry? Well, some of the things. Remember that people came to the Passover celebration from all over the world, all over the Jewish world. There's a list of them in Acts 2 from all the places where they came. And then you'll remember the Ethiopian had come up for Passover, that Philip was part of the conversion. And when you come to Jerusalem, then you have to pay a half shekel temple tax. But the problem is that probably the money you have with you has an inscription of a Nero or emperor or some other god or some god, and that cannot be used for your temple tax. So what happens? You have to exchange it. Well, what's the exchange rate? Well, the exchange rate is whatever the priest says it is. And so if you've got priests who are less than honest, then that can get to be very much a fraud. It can be very unfair. The other thing is, of course, all adult males had to bring a sacrifice consistent with their wealth, either a lamb or a dove. And the animal or the bird had to be without spot and without blemish. And the key to that is that the one who determined if it was without spot or without blemish was one of the priests. So you could bring a lamb from home, and he could find something wrong with it. And he could say, well, you can't offer that one, but I've got this one that I'll sell you for a fee. And who sets the fee? The priest sets the fee. And it got to be just a racket. And that's what was so angering to Jesus. Number one, they were taking advantage of the money changers because they were charging ridiculous rates of exchange. And they were taking advantage of the people who were trying to make an offering by finding something wrong with theirs, requiring them to buy another. Or maybe they came without one. If they came a great distance, it may have not been practical for them to bring their own offering. And so they would sell them one, and they would determine the fee. And it was a little bit of a supply and demand situation. And sometimes the demand got to be way out of line with what it should have been. And that was the thing that really infuriated Jesus, I'm sure, as he entered into this. Well, we're going to come back and visit this particular event and see what we can gather from it as far as the mind of Jesus and the heart of Jesus is concerned next week, Lord willing. Thank you so much for being with us, and have a wonderful God bless week.